Hello everyone and welcome to the Drydock episode 363. This week the questions are taken from guide 431 on the Type 9 U-boats, the Wednesday video on Forgotten Theatres looking at the Royal Navy's activities in the Indian Ocean in 1942 through 44, and the Friday video on the Force de Raid, France's fast capital ship force at the beginning of the war. So let's get on with questions. Antonius Pius asks, you've talked about this for surface ships, but how fast could a submarine accelerate from, let's say, 12 knots cruising speed to 18 knots maximum speed? Obviously it'll vary by sub, but maybe pick one or generalize. Well, as you correctly surmised, it does vary quite a bit. Some of it is going to vary depending on the submarine's size, in its power to weight ratio, or what's the top speed of the sub. You know, if the sub can just about hit 18 knots, then it's going to take longer to reach that speed than a submarine that, say, can do 22 knots on the surface and power through the acceleration from 12 to 18 much more quickly. And especially for submarines, even more so than for other vessels that spend most of their time on the surface, the sea condition is going to make a huge difference, because if the sea's in a relatively calm condition, like you can see in this photo, it's going to accelerate pretty quickly. Whereas if the seas are quite choppy and you've got waves breaking quite regularly over the bow, that's going to slow it down. But in ideal circumstances, if we say that we've got a submarine that can do 19 to 20 knots on the surface on a good day and 18 knots on a bad day, so you're not redlining the engines to get up to 18 knots, then based on the available data for various submarines, I would say it's probably going to take you between 2.5 to 5 minutes to get from 12 knots to 18 knots on most subs, with the variance basically being, some submarines, at least when we're talking about World War II subs, some submarines, as I said, will have a slightly higher power to weight ratio and finer bows compared to other subs, which will have slightly bluffer bows and a lower power to weight ratio. But it doesn't really take that long to get a ultimately relatively small craft up through the teens of knots. It's when you start getting beyond that things really start to slow down, both in terms of weight and speed. Steve Weinberg asks, speaking of U-534, I'm curious if there's any news on it. Originally, they were very active on YouTube, and you started a monthly series with them, but then everything went dark a couple of years ago. Yes, in fact, there are some updates with good old U-534 up in Birkenhead. So they've done a fair bit of work in stabilising and preserving the ship, or the sub, I guess, as it is in situ. They've moved all the artifacts and documents into an archive building in a separate museum, which is helping to preserve them. They've started cataloguing them, and there's some really, really interesting stuff. We're talking unique, one-of-a-kind stuff that hasn't survived anywhere else. Like, for example, do you want to know the exact specifications of the scuttling charges for this type of U-boat? Guess what? I've got a copy of that document now. The Zaukönig 2 torpedo, you can see one just sitting there in the bottom left. Do you want to see what a working torpedo detonator looks like? Well, except for the whole blowing you up bit. Well, I'm going to be showing you that in a few weeks' time. Essentially, what happened was, shockingly, if you watched some of the videos that I did earlier on U-534, we're talking about the same council that kicked U-534 out of its original display home, and therefore kind of, not quite directly, but very close to directly, led to it being cut up. The one that kicked out the museum and then proceeded to do nothing with the space that they'd freed up for decades. That council? Yeah, shockingly enough, that council really dragged its heels about giving planning permission to actually get the museum that's planned to be built around U-534 built. So they have the planning permission now, and that means that they can, continue working on the project, because obviously there's a certain amount that they needed to do to stabilize U-534 as she was, but there's not a huge amount more that they could do to her at that point until they can get some shelter over her and make sure that that preservation level sticks. So yeah, there is progress. You will be seeing more about her in the near future, and hopefully the museum will be ready in a year or two. The Mighty Nanto asks, Drac, up until I saw your video on the loss of HMS Hood, I believe the most likely cause for the explosion was that Bismarck's 15-inch shell actually struck and penetrated Hood's belt armour right where her 15-inch magazines aft were, and then detonated. I believe that to be the case because, firstly, the fatal hit happens at approximately 16,000 yards, and at that distance Bismarck shells, due to their quality and flatter trajectory, could strike on and penetrate Hood's belt armour fairly well. I've read at that range it could penetrate up to 17 inches of armour. And secondly, the artillery officer on Bismarck did in fact report the shell had in fact penetrated Hood's belt armour, if I'm not mistaken. So do you think it's possible that this could have happened, or do you still think your theory is the most plausible? And if so, are there any notions that disprove the theory of a shell penetrating Hood's belt armour? Okay, so let's deal with a few things. The crew aboard Bismarck obviously were fairly certain they'd struck Hood, because, well, she exploded amongst other things. But you've got to remember that Hood was a little bit over 9 miles away through visibility conditions that, while not terrible, they weren't perfect either. And there was also a fair amount of sea spray smashing up against Hood's engaged side. So, with the best will in the world, even with the absolute best optics of a German battleship, at just over 9 miles, there is practically no way you're going to be seeing with enough resolution and enough detail to be able to go, ah, yes, I have seen the shell strike and I know it specifically hit Hood's belt armour. It's just not a thing. You could get the impression that you've hit Hood in a given location, so we've hit roughly here, and it's on the hull. That is about as much as you're going to get from those kind of optics at that kind of range. But the two biggest markers against German shell penetrating Hood's belt armour at the range and angle that I believe Hood was at the time comes from, well, one part of physical evidence about the destruction of Hood herself, and the other part is to do with penetration tables and thicknesses. So the first part is that when Hood was destroyed, as I mentioned in the video, the first thing that was seen was this kind of blowtorch-like flame coming up from around the mainmast, and only shortly thereafter did the main magazines cook off. Now, if the shell from Bismarck had penetrated the main belt and gone straight into the magazines, I mean, there's some question as to whether that would even work given the shallow nature of the shell penetrating and the where the magazines are, but nonetheless, let's even assume that this is somehow occurred. The magazine should just detonate. There's no reason for a magazine fire to collapse several bulkheads horizontally to the point of the mainmast and then go up air intakes in the machinery spaces before the main magazine cooks off. And even with a 4-inch magazine being hit, if it's hit directly, it's going to be near the top of the magazine, if at all, at which point, again, that fire should vent either back through the shell hole, through the side of the ship, or via other paths upwards. Again, there's no particular reason for the shell to vent up through the machinery space vents, unless it's gone through the machinery space and breached that bulkhead in the first place, at which point, then we're basically back to my theory. The other thing that is sometimes forgotten when it comes to working out whether Hood's armour could resist or not is that Hood's armour is, in this situation, doubly angled. And what I mean by that is that, as you can see here from this view of Hood's stern area while she's under construction, yes, Hood has 12 inches of armour, but that armour is already angled in the manner of the Nelsons, the US fast battleships much after them, etc. So that's increasing its apparent thickness to an incoming shell anyway, which of course decreases overall penetration. But then Hood is also coming in at an angle. So there is not just a vertical drop angle, there is also a horizontal angle. involved. And at the point that she was at in her approach to Bismarck, if you resolve those two angles to generate a final apparent angle for the shell going through the armor, the effective angle is basically just a little bit under 44 degrees of angling, which is quite a lot. That significantly increases the resistance of the armor to an incoming shell, and then you've obviously got the shell's own fall of shot on top of this. And interestingly enough, that work, if you want to recalculate from German armor penetration curves, has actually been redone a little while ago by Bill Jurens. So I'm going to show one of the tables that he generated now. And what you can see here is a graph that shows angle of impact versus striking velocity. So the obliquity, the overall calculated angle, versus the striking velocity of the shell, so how fast the shell is going, because obviously that can vary somewhat. And then you've got three curves, 127, 178, and 305 mil. So that's showing the various thicknesses of armor on hood. 305, of course, being the 12-inch armor belt. So then you've got the curve of 305 millimeters. You know, can it be penetrated by a German 15-inch shell? And as you can see, if you're just shooting completely perpendicular to it, then a striking velocity of about 360, maybe 365 meters per second, it can be penetrated. But as the angle of that armor increases, so too does the speed at which you need to actually hit the armor to go through. So the armor resistance is increasing. So you then have 530 and 570. So that's the range of potential velocities in meters per second that the shell could have been traveling at. So that gives us a window on our y-axis. And then you see at the top there's another couple of dashed lines. So you've got 73 and 53. So that is the relative angle of hood depending on where you think she was. So 73 degrees, 90 degrees obviously would be she's broadside on to Bismarck. She's running in parallel. So 73 degrees, which then translates into a final apparent angle for the shell impacting the armor, as you can see there, of just under 30 degrees, about 28 and a half. That's if she's at the end of her final turn, which I don't believe she ever started, and then 53 degrees, which leads to, as we just said, just under 44 degrees of apparent angle for the shell. That is the position that she's in at the beginning of the turn. And because those brackets create, with the velocity as well, create a box, you have that shaded box, and that shaded box there shows you whether or not armor penetration could take place. So as you can see, regardless of the shell velocity, if Hood had completed her turn, then you'd end up to the left-hand side of the curve, i.e. the shell would have penetrated. And if she has not yet actually started physically turning at the beginning of the final turn, which was just about, I believe, to be executed, then you're on the right-hand side of that box, and you can see you're actually far, far below on the right, far away from being able to penetrate the belt. And then obviously, you know, because there's more of that dark surface area to the right than to the left, it basically means that as if Hood was somewhere through that turn, for the majority of that turn, obviously more so if the shell velocity was lower than higher, but in both cases, for the majority of her turn, she would have still been safe from a penetrating shot by a German 15-inch shell at that range. And then as she comes into the final elements of the turn, she becomes vulnerable. Obviously, a higher velocity, she becomes vulnerable earlier than later. But since I believe the other evidence shows that Hood, while she had the signal flying, had not yet actually initiated the turn to any meaningful degree, that means you're looking at the right-hand side of this box, and you're actually well below the effective point at which you can actually penetrate Hood's main belt. Tully DT asks, how do you think the American submarine fleet would have fared if it had been subject to the same caliber of anti-submarine warfare that the U-boat fleet faced? Well, obviously it wouldn't have fared anywhere near as well as they did historically, and obviously historically there were a number of losses regardless. So I think, apart from the fact, well, the anti-submarine warfare crews are being somewhat more competent and, having depth charges that go deep enough, and then eventually having Hedgehog and having far more widespread sonar, etc., etc., all of that would be big negatives against the survival of US subs. And of course, the more US subs are lost, the more crews that don't come home, the less experience is available to pass on to newer submarine crews. So you could potentially end up in a bit of a skill death spiral, which was similar to that which affected a number of U-boats in the mid to late stages of World War II. But there are some other factors to consider, because that's more of what the enemy is doing. The enemy is becoming more effective. But let's consider a few other factors which could be pluses or minuses for the boats that are more to do with the boats themselves and their immediate opposition. So first thing to note is, of course, even if the Japanese anti-submarine forces magically become as competent as the British anti-submarine forces and Canadian anti-submarine forces in the Atlantic, there just aren't as many of them. So, if there physically aren't as many of them, you can maybe circumvent escorts, just, not attack where the escorts are. And if there's fewer of them, they might be a little more hesitant to chase you down particularly far, the way that some British escorts would do. Because, if you've got half a dozen corvettes or sloops escorting a convoy, then one can potentially afford to chase down a submarine for quite a long time. If you've only got two, you can't really afford to do that without leaving the convoy open to a lot of attack. So that would be a plus point for the US subs as compared to what the U-boats face. There's just not as many people gunning for them. Then you've got to account for, a few negatives. The American fleet boats are quite big. This means they're slightly easier to spot from the air, and it means although they're not slow divers, they're not as fast at diving compared to, submarines half their size, shockingly enough. Which means in those edge cases where a sub is caught on the surface, then they'd be, on average, more likely to be caught and killed than the average German U-boat, because, well, a Type 7 is much smaller than a Gato, and even a Type 9 is a little bit smaller. They also can't dive quite as deep as some of the mid to late war German subs, at least until you get the Balaus and Tenches, which obviously means if you can't dive as deep, then anti-submarine weapons have a shorter travel time to get to you, and it means your pressure hull is weaker, which means you're slightly more susceptible to damage, so that's a mark against. But there are marks in favour, which might help to balance things out a bit. For example, the fact that the Gatos are pretty darn quick on the surface for submarines. They are, of course, originally designed as fleet subs. They can easily clear 21, 22 knots. The German subs couldn't. So when submarines were caught on the surface, there are various accounts of instances where you have corvettes and so forth that are roughly capable of a similar speed to the German U-boats on the surface, 17, 18 knots, or where a German sub is slightly faster. Maybe the German sub can hit 18, 19 knots and that particular escort can only do 16 or 17. Then the German sub, that is the U-boat, could pull away, outrun them on the surface, and as long as that race starts out of range of the deck gun, then the U-boat can just run away from the surface escort, and there's not a lot that can be done. If you've got a sloop that can maybe go a little bit quicker, or then later on an escort destroyer or an all-converted destroyer, then that changes the equation, but it's still a bit of a chase. Whereas a US sub, which intrinsically has, a 4 to 5 knot advantage on the surface over German subs, they can outpace a lot more escorts and do that a lot quicker than the German subs can. So that would increase their survivability. Of course, if the Japanese convoy escorts can do 25 plus knots, then it's not going to make too much of a difference. But against the slower ones, it does make quite a substantial increase in survivability if you happen to be accidentally caught on the surface and the enemy doesn't have air power to go after you. Another thing that might work in their favour is that you've got 6 torpedo tubes up front and some at the stern, as opposed to a typical Type 7, which only has 4 up front, which means you get more torpedoes to shoot at convoys, and if you maybe shoot 4, it means you've retained 2 torpedoes that you could potentially shoot at escorts. You might not necessarily kill the escort, but you might force it to evade, which will give you time to yourself evade and go and hide. So that could help out, and obviously, more aft-firing torpedoes as well helps. So yeah, overall, there would be a lot more losses, and there are some elements of American fleet boat design that would exacerbate this, but there are also other elements of US fleet boat design that if we were transposing, Battle of the Atlantic grade escorts and crews over to the Pacific, that might actually stand the US subs in better stead than not. So I think overall you could probably call the various sub-based factors a bit of a wash, and it would just be a case of, well, more skilled crews equals more subs lost. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, in the most recent Drydock, you mentioned an effort by the Russians to convert an ironclad into an aircraft carrier. This got me thinking, had Fisher not managed to get all the Royal Navy's obsolete vessels purged in the 1900s, would any of those vessels have made for a good 1910s carrier conversion, either with or without changing the power plant to something a bit more modern? The funny thing is, initially I was going to say no, because a lot of the ironclads, well, pretty much all of them, are far too slow to be a reasonable carrier. And then I thought, hang on a minute, 2 things. One, the Russian proposal, based on the Admiral Lazarev as seen here, that thing could only go, not even 11 knots. And then I realised, oh yeah, 1910s. Your forward speed doesn't matter that much in terms of launching aircraft, because either you can just crane float planes over the side, or they're World War I aircraft. They basically, well, it's not they don't need a takeoff space and wind speed, but they need very, very little compared to the interwar carriers and interwar aircraft. So if you're trying to do a seaplane carrier in the theme of, Ark Royal or Campania or Engadine, or you were trying to do something like this Admiral Lazarev conversion, well, at that point, almost any of the Royal Navy's big ironclads would suffice, because the Lazarev was less than 4,000 tons. So, even Warrior's bigger than that, at which point, yeah, you can fit some World War I biplanes on almost anything that'll float. The main restriction in terms of speed is going to be the fact that, well, these things are going to be ancillaries, either operating on their own, like with the Cuxhaven raid, or supporting fixed operations like Gallipoli. Basically, there aren't any ironclads that can keep up with the Grand Fleet. So that might be a problem. Although, if you take some of the later ironclads and maybe fit new turbine engines, you might get them up to a point where they can at least fit with keep up with the cruising speed of the Grand Fleet, and then deploy aircraft behind the lines or something like that. But there is actually then another ship, or pair of ships more particularly, that might make excellent for the 1910s carrier conversions. And that's the powerful class cruisers, which were considered obsolete by the time of World War I. They'd been moved over to training-only roles. Now, these things at baseline are 22 knots, so they can easily keep up with the Grand Fleet even at battle speed, and that's with vertical triple expansion engines. If you were to replace their power plant with oil-fired boilers and modern geared steam turbines, they're probably going to go a lot quicker than that. And obviously you're going to save a huge amount of machinery space. Now, they're around about 540 feet long, which is very large for their time. It would put them on the lower end of carriers. We're talking about something like HMS Argus, about lengthwise. But firstly, you can give them a little bit of an overhang. Secondly, they'd still be much bigger than pretty much any other World War I period carrier. and a heck of a lot faster as well, at which point, yeah, you could really get some mileage out of those two. Especially since the British reckon they got reasonable service out of Vindictive, and while Vindictive's hull overall was fractionally longer than Powerful and Terrible, the flight deck was only a partial one. So if you speed these things up and put a full-length flight deck, HMS Furious style, for example, over them, then, yeah, these would actually be pretty darn useful for the 1910s and maybe into the early 1930s as test beds. C. Babylon asks, if the two cruisers that had been sunk by the Japanese in the Indian Ocean and Hermes, along with a couple of groups of Fulmars, were all operating together, do you think they would have stood a better chance, or is it safe to say the outcome would have been the same, in your opinion, considering how much better the Zeros were at the time, and the pilots as well? I think there'd probably be a little bit of a question as to whether or not you could actually fit Fulmars in Hermes, and I say in rather than on. Fulmars would not have a problem operating off of Hermes. That's easily enough proven by the fact they operated off of carriers with even shorter flight decks and moving at slower speeds. But yeah, I think you might have some problems trying to squeeze the Fulmars into the hangar. But nonetheless, if we assume for the sake of argument that you can do, or they just go with a bunch of Fulmars just up on deck, or maybe they invent a folding tail version of a Fulmar, whatever, let's run with it. And we say that there's maybe a dozen or so Fulmars, maybe one or two more aboard Hermes. If you've got Cornwall and Dorsetshire operating in close conjunction to provide anti-aircraft fire as well, would they survive? Possibly, but questionable. The main thing is that the vast majority of the Japanese aircraft that show up over Hermes are dive bombers. And while there are some Zeros, a small number launched in escort of the overwhelming, dive bomber strike, the formation is a little bit split. So not every single one of the 80-plus dive bombers goes after Hermes. Others, as per that video, go off and attack other things. So you're not necessarily going to have all the Zeros there. At which point, if you know that they're coming, that is the Japanese aircraft, you know that they are on their way. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that Hermes gets all 12, let's say 12 Fulmars up in the air, there's still an awful lot of dive bombers coming in. And yeah, Zero versus Fulmar is not really a fair fight, but there will be more Fulmars. So while the Zeros are maybe going after some of the Fulmars, if indeed there are any Zeros in this particular attack, then the other Fulmars will be able to go after the dive bombers. And of course that supposes that A, there are Zeros with the attack, and B, that they spot the Fulmars before the Fulmars start attacking the dive bombers. So essentially it's going to come down to, can a combination of anti-aircraft fire from Cornwall, Dorsetshire and Hermes, plus the effects of Fulmar attacks, break up and disrupt the dive bombers sufficient that they miss their targets or split their attention and don't inflict fatal damage on any one of their targets? Therefore, in that case, yes, in theory, you could end up with Hermes potentially surviving, albeit potentially somewhat damaged. But equally, if the Fulmars misjudge their attack on the Vals, if the Zeros, if there are half a dozen Zeros with them and they get the bounce on the Fulmars, or if the Vals just keep on coming, let's say the first dozen or 2 dozen are disrupted, but then the next dozen or 2 dozen are not disrupted, then you could still end up with Hermes being sunk. So it would give the ship a possibility of survival, and certainly there is strength in numbers, but it is also possible that she would still be sunk outright. It would really be luck of the draw. Cap 1984-62 asks, I'd like to ask 2 things. First of all, when in your estimation does an aircraft carrier cease to be an aircraft carrier and an amphibious warfare ship come into being? And secondly, with regard to lines or rope in common parlance, in the US for a long time these were made of hemp, leading to stories traded among certain subcultures of fields of government-planted and owned cannabis. Was the US alone in this, or do similar tales of government-owned cannabis fields exist in other major naval powers? So, for me at least, the line between aircraft carrier and amphibious warfare ship is probably more easily drawn in the period after the Channel covers. So when you have, say, a ship that's primarily carrying helicopters, then it's probably an amphibious warfare ship, less of an aircraft carrier. But for World War II, if you wanted to say this is definitely an amphibious warfare ship and no longer functioning as an aircraft carrier, one, that's a lot harder because it's going to be operating fixed-wing aircraft, so, therefore they are dual use. So you would have to look not just at the type of aircraft it's operating, but also at the weapons loadout and maybe at the mix of aircraft it was operating. So if you wanted to have a ship where in World War II, where I would point it and say, yeah, this is an amphibious warfare vessel, it's no longer functioning as an aircraft carrier, then I think you would probably be looking at an escort carrier, but an escort carrier where its air group was composed entirely of strike aircraft, like, say, Avengers, and observation aircraft, and its magazines were loaded pretty much with just rockets and high explosive bombs. Now, of course, you can use Avengers and high explosive bombs and rockets on ships, but if you've got purely that, so no armor-piercing bombs, no torpedoes, no fighters, then I think at that point you probably could make an argument that this is a ship that's primarily designed to support land operations, or that's its primary use at the time. But until you get the advent of helicopters, which obviously are fairly useless in long-range strike against enemy shipping, but fairly good in amphibious operations, which of course, as I say, is mostly in the period past what the Channel covers, before the introduction of the helicopter, it gets much more difficult to make the clear divider. Now, in terms of the hemp, almost everybody's ropes and at some point even sails could and were made of hemp, various other materials as well, but hemp was very common. And yes, that does mean large amounts of hemp plants being grown. However, there is a slight difference. Now, I can't remember which way round it goes, because the growing on cultivation of hemp is not something that I'm particularly interested in nor have any expertise in. But what I am aware of from actually being in the rope museum section at Chatham Dockyard is that one of the genders of the hemp plant, I can't remember whether it's male or female, but basically one of them is the one that produces the hallucinogen, the THC, etc., that people want to smoke, and the other one doesn't. And the one that doesn't is the one that's typically grown for making fiber, which you then turn into sails and rope and all sorts of other things that are useful to you. Apparently, it's something to do with it that particular side of the plant family, of the hemp family, makes better fibers for whatever reason. It's not particularly my area of expertise. But what that does mean is that, and actually for that matter, even today, there are large fields of not necessarily government owned, but officially licensed and grown hemp in the UK for things like hempcrete, which is an environmentally friendly concrete alternative for building stuff with and making fibers for clothes and so forth. But anyway, the point of it is the kind of hemp that you grow for making fibers, completely useless for getting high off of. So you could try, but you would probably either just die from smoke inhalation or accidentally setting yourself on fire long before you felt the slightest amount of intoxication. Ozzy Unstolstrauf, I think, apologies if I mispronounced that, asks, in your Operation Cerberus video, you consider the German movement of their major surface forces to Germany and then on to Norway from Western France as basically a bad idea. My question is, why is that? I think the securing of Norway for the Allies would have enabled Allied bomber forces to operate closer to the German mainland and would have secured the Arctic convoys from attack by surface raiders. Well, the reason I think Cerberus's concept of moving the Scharnhorst and Prinz Eugen over to Germany and then eventually up to Norway after a lot of repairs, at least for Scharnhorst and Prinz Eugen, the reason I think that was a bad idea is kind of twofold. Firstly, if the Allies were really determined to go after Norway, with the best will in the world, no amount of Kriegsmarine forces are going to deter them. Even if Gneisenau isn't as badly damaged by mines as she is, and even if she isn't then bombed and is effectively destroyed in dock by the RAF, so even if by handwave magic Scharnhorst, Gneisenau and Prinz Eugen all make it through basically undamaged and are then deployed to Norway, well, you've got potentially what, in terms of heavy surface units, Hipper, Prinz Eugen, Admiral Scheer and Lutzow, so 4 heavy cruisers, Scharnhorst, Gneisenau and Tirpitz, so 3 battleships and 4 heavy cruisers. If the Allies were really, really, really determined to go after Norway, if they'd actually wanted to invade Norway, take it over, as you said, secure the Arctic convoy route, maybe launch bomber raids from the southern Norway into German-occupied Europe, 2 small and 1 large battleship and 4 heavy cruisers plus some destroyers, that's not going to stop an Anglo-American armada. They'd either do what they did to Tirpitz, bomb it in place, or they just sit outside the fjord where the German ships were holed up with a dozen heavy cruisers, 4 to 6 battleships, and a bunch of aircraft carriers and dare them to come out, and sanitize the area with 24 anti-submarine escorts. So there's a lot of things that the Germans could do to make Norway unappealing as a target for the Allies, but almost none of them involve the Kriegsmarine's surface forces. Whether they're there or not, it's really not going to make any difference. U-boat presence, maybe. Luftwaffe and German army presence on coastal defences, much more of a problem. What was left of the German surface fleet? Not really. And at the same time, there's the second part, is that as long as there were German heavy units on the western coast of France, that was a major problem for the Allies because they could leave at any point and make a high-speed dash out into the Atlantic, and then you've got heavy capital ships, potentially multiple heavy capital ships, out in the Atlantic. This is a really, really big problem for the convoys. By doing Operation Cerberus, you remove that threat. So now, instead of having to send multiple battleships out as convoy escorts all the time, and keeping a reserve of faster, more modern battleships ready and potentially some carriers as well, in order to react to a German sailing, which is a huge investment of resources, now all of those ships are basically freed up. Because now it becomes, well, do we have some ships in the home fleet to stop a potential breakout? Yes. And can we use those ships to escort Arctic convoys? Yes. But for that, you only need, 2 to 4 modern capital ships and maybe a couple of carriers. You would have needed 3 times as many capital ships, if not more, to deal with just the potential threat of German capital ships breaking out into the Atlantic from the French Atlantic ports. Now, okay, staying in Brest maybe not such a good idea, considering the Royal Air Force was doing a very good job of turning that place into something more resembling the moon than a Western French city. But there are other French ports further down, that would be a lot more difficult for the RAF to attack, where you could keep the ships and still maintain that threat. So in terms of a threat forcing the Allies to devote an awful lot of resources to, I'm sorry, but any arbitrary number of Kriegsmarine surface units in French Atlantic ports is going to tie down an awful lot more Allied resources than they ever were going to do in Norway. The Rogue Chief asks, I recently read Garcia Marquez's non-fiction novella Story of a Shipwrecked Sailor, and I was wondering if you could go into further detail about the actual ARC Caldas Incident and her topside overloading issues. Was it more of an issue with her design that made her top-heavy, like some of the American and German interwar destroyers, or did she really have so many home appliances stowed on deck as to cause problems? Okay, so for those who haven't read it, the exceptionally brief summary is the ARC Caldas, a Colombian destroyer, is heading back from the US after a refit, and a number of sailors are washed overboard in heavy seas, of which only one survives. The official government line is that there was a storm which washed them overboard, but then a story is published, the story of the shipwrecked sailor, which reveals that in fact there wasn't a storm. There were some rough seas, but the main contributor, at least in the story, is the fact that the ship is massively overloaded up top with things like stoves and refrigerators and other contraband, which the sailors are trying to bring home. Now, in terms of which is more to blame, her design or all that contraband, I think it's a mixture of both, because when I was looking at the design of the Caldas and her sister ship, which are part of the Antioquia class, something immediately stood out to me. These ships, although not built in the UK, built in Lisbon in Portugal, are very clearly, both in looks and in initial loadout, inspired by contemporary British destroyers. So, tell me where you've heard this specification before. 4 single 4.7-inch guns, 2 quadruple torpedo tubes. Oh yeah, that's basically almost all the alphabet, or up to the J class, all the alphabet destroyers that the Royal Navy built. And indeed, she is built in the early 1930s. So I thought, well, hang on a minute. Let's have a mosey on the rest of the stats. And then I realized, this design is already going to be somewhat top-heavy, somewhat unstable. Because when you compare the Antioquia class with the E and F class, which are their approximate contemporaries, the E's and the F's have a standard displacement of about 1,400 tons for exactly the same main gun and torpedo armament. They're about as fast as each other, and dimensionally, the Antioquias are only about 6 foot shorter than the E's and the F's, but they are also 2 foot narrower. Now, you might think that's not too much of an issue, but you're talking about just under a 2% reduction in length, but around about a 7% reduction in beam, which would explain in part why they're capable of both going around about 36 knots, despite the Antioquias having significantly less power output, again, percentage-wise. So we're already looking at a ship that's somewhat slimmer, and therefore is going to be somewhat more unstable with the similar levels of top weight. But also overall, the Colombian destroyers are around about 200 tons lighter. So you've got a slimmer vessel that is considerably lighter. We're talking 14 to 15% less displacement, but has pretty much exactly the same armament up top. And then when you compare things like range, and you see the Colombian ships are somewhat shorter range, it suddenly becomes very clear that as well as slimming down the hull and having a slightly smaller machinery plant, they're also carrying somewhat less fuel, which means that almost all the weight reduction in the Antioquias compared to the E's and the F's is happening right down below. So you're making a lighter ship down below, keeping the weight up top. That is not going to be a particularly stable vessel to start with. Then you factor in that she'd just been in for a refit in the States, and she'd had her 4 4.7s replaced by 2 5-inch 38s. And you might think, actually, that's a good thing. But when you look at the weight of the 4.7-inch above deck mounts that are kind of British standard, compared with the weight of the single 5-inch 38s that the ships received, actually, those 5-inch 38 mounts each weigh slightly more, only by a couple of tons, but still, than 2 4.7-inch mounts. And then you've got all the other systems and the guns themselves, because we're talking about just the mounting system. So despite the fact that it loses one of its quad torpedo launchers, it's also gaining a bunch of anti-submarine weapons and new fire control systems. So overall, Caldas is probably leaving that shipyard with somewhat more top weight than she went in with. at which point her stability issues are only going to get worse. So her design definitely has a major part to play, but when you consider that, refrigerators, stoves, that kind of stuff, I mean, they're not heavy in terms of, they don't weigh multiple tons, but they are still quite heavy, and we are talking about 1950s versions of these appliances, so heavier than you're probably used to these days. And if you've got a lot of them up top, because there's, almost 200 men aboard, yeah, that could actually start to be a problem, because it would only take a few dozen such things up top to start simulating the weight of essentially like sticking another 4.7-inch mount back in, and then you're going to really compound the stability issues. Plus, of course, this is, relatively speaking, unsecured cargo. It may be strapped down, it may be sitting exactly on the deck, I'm not entirely sure. But to be honest, even if it is strapped down, it's not going to be strapped down particularly well, because there aren't, deck mounting cargo strap points on destroyers, because they're not designed for that. So if the ship does hit some kind of heavy seas, I can also see all that cargo moving around somewhat, especially if it gets hit by water coming over the ship. And combine all those factors together, and yeah, you really are going to have a ship that's going to be seriously unstable, and therefore, as the narrative suggests in the book, that you're going to need to call men to try and counterbalance that, and if they're up top, well, then some of them are probably going to get washed over, which is what happens. Jeffrey Conley asks, what would the naval aspect of the Russo-Japanese War have looked like if every warship was a late Age of Sail vessel? Assuming that Japanese modernization in this new setting still somehow happens. Well, for the purposes of this answer, I'm going to assume that means full technological reversion to the late Age of Sail, because a late Age of Sail fleet trying to combine, that with 12-inch long-range guns, torpedoes, and mines is, that's just too difficult, really. Apart from anything, they'd probably roll over and sink. So if we're assuming late Age of Sail, so we're talking about ships with auxiliary steam engines and a mixture of solid shot and shell guns, that's actually potentially quite an interesting one, because you could loosely swap out the pre-dreadnought battleships for first rates, armoured cruisers for third rates, and, well, destroyers and smaller cruisers would be various grades of frigate, large fifth rates for the small cruisers, and then maybe sixth rates for the destroyers. Now, the interesting thing is with late Age of Sail, because you've got the auxiliary steam engines, there is still a degree of manoeuvring free of the wind, but you have everything happening at slightly slower speed and considerably slower range. The weird thing is that this probably overall actually favours Japan, because you'll have the initial Russian Pacific Squadron in Port Arthur. Now, the Japanese actually lost a reasonable number of ships, either completely sunk or damaged to mines during their blockade of Port Arthur, and of course they had the surprise torpedo attack. Now, the analogous weapon would be a fire ship attack. Now, considering that the Russian ships are at anchor, and looking at the overall response time of the Russian forces to the attack, and then the limited range of the late Age of Sail guns, I would hazard that a small fast fire ship attack by the Japanese would have at least as good and possibly quite somewhat better results than the torpedo boat attack. Of course, the one downside for the Japanese is that Makarov was killed by a mine. If mines aren't a thing at this point, because you only really see them in any kind of practical way in the Crimean War right at the very end and of the Age of Sail, and even then they're not particularly effective, then it's possible that when Makarov tries to sail his fleet to escape, they might actually escape. But then that butterflies the whole war away to a point we can't really predict. But if we assume that it still goes wrong in some way, then, as covered recently, crew skill does make a much, much bigger difference the further back in time you go. And of course, when the 2nd Pacific Squadron shows up, not only are the Japanese ships are likely to be more numerous because they won't have lost ships to mines. But then as Togo does his maneuver, well, cutting across the enemy T is a classic Age of Sail maneuver. And while Rozesvensky has managed to do a huge amount in bringing his crews up to par compared to where they were when they left in the first place, the simple fact is that at Tsushima, one of the things that they were still a little bit behind in was fleet maneuvers, and fleet maneuvers are incredibly important for this kind of activity. So without the forward-firing heavy guns that you have in pre-dreadnought battleships, Togo's crossing the T maneuver is likely to be actually even more effective than it was at the historical Battle of Tsushima. And at that point, well, it's going to go quite badly for the Russian 2nd Pacific Squadron, with the sole caveat, of course, that even with shell guns, it's going to take somewhat longer to batter the Russian fleet into submission, and therefore there might be some more survivors and more surrendered ships. The Judge 2017 asks, recently I was rewatching your video when you visited USS Midway and was puzzled by the markings on the superstructure near the bridge. Obviously the kill marks are for Vietnam, but what do the multiple different letters each represent? I believe some other ships have similar markings, and that makes me wonder, are they the same? So these various colourful letters represent various awards that the ship has won during its career, because there are internal naval competitions, or at least there were, I don't know if there still are in the 21st century US Navy, where different departments, if they excelled within their squadron, fleet, assignment, etc., could get different awards based on where they were. So, if I am reading the definitions correctly, going from left to right, the white E with the sort of shadow effect is a battle efficiency award called Battle E. The yellow E means that they've got an award for their efficiency of their air department. The green E signifies an efficiency award for the operations department. The red DC is an award for the damage control team. The black W signifies that the weapons department has been recognized as particularly efficient at some point. And finally, the crossed anchors within the wheel represents that the ship's navigation department has at some point won an award. I think that's the correct order. Obviously, those of you who've served in the US Navy in more recent times can drop in and tell me if I got it all right. Rebel Skverl asks, during the time period the channel covers, there were several occasions when warships would dismount some of their lighter guns to support a landing party or even help conduct a portion of a land campaign. What was involved in doing this? Did warships normally carry wheeled mounts for their guns and ammunition caissons as a matter of course, or were they ad hoc constructions as and when the need arose? Or did they just borrow some from whatever nearby army happened to be around? It very much depends on the time and circumstances. So you can see here, this is a gun that was carried aboard HMS Warrior. It's a pretty small Armstrong breech loader, but it is very much definitively a gun for use on land. The carriage is completely unsuitable for naval operations, but as you can see with the little ammo box on the back and the big wheels, it's actually quite good for land ops. Now, this is, of course, the mid-Victorian period where naval brigades ashore probably saw a lot more action than their ships did at sea. And, you know, the naval brigade landing, gunboat diplomacy, etc. was very, very much in vogue. However, in more broad terms, Royal Navy ships, at least once they got big enough, like Warrior and going forward, generally did carry at least some guns that were specifically for use ashore. Even if you look in the inventories of the King George V class battleships of World War II, they actually have one or two field guns stored somewhere in the ship, which are explicitly for the use of naval landing brigades. But if we're talking about a major part of the ship's armament, as opposed to a dedicated land gun that they're happy to be carrying, this will depend a lot on the circumstances of why they're landing it. So if you are landing guns that are going to be transported over a relatively short distance, perhaps to reinforce a fortification or something like that, or to assist in a landward attack on an enemy fort that is on the coast, Then, if we're looking at the Age of Sail or even the early Age of Iron, they literally just pick some guns and crane them out. And the thing is, the naval gun carriage that's prevalent for most of the period until they get far too heavy, so the four-wheeled carriage with the small wheels that you've seen if you've been aboard Constitution, Victory, any of those sort of period of ships, that is really good for compact type maneuvering and high friction in a naval context, terrible for use on land. Whereas, as the Armada showed, big wheels like this, really good for use on land, terrible for use at sea. So if you're only taking the guns a short distance, you can keep them on their naval gun carriages. If you're planning on taking them significant distances, then you're going to need a somewhat better carriage. And those generally would be improvised. Sometimes, if it was known that a naval landing party would be needed, probably during that particular commission, an enterprising captain might carry some wheels, some big wheels, and perhaps some broken down land carriages somewhere in the hold, and then they'd put them together and adapt. But of course, ships carry carpenters. There's usually plenty of wood available, so they can knock together a half-decent land carriage pretty quickly anyway. As you progress further into the Age of Iron and then into the Age of Steel, you do have a little bit of a margin where guns can still be dismounted by either relatively austere port facilities or the ship's own facilities themselves. Not necessarily the biggest guns, but some of the ship's guns. And the guns themselves can be dismounted and then put on various carriages. So by the time you get to World War II, for example, taking apart a 5.25-inch turret to get at those guns, or, heaven forbid, taking off the roof of a 14-inch turret and lifting out one of those, is really impractical outside of circumstances where you have major dock facilities. And if you have major dock facilities, you're probably at home, so you don't need to do so, at least for naval brigade campaigns. Whereas in, say, the late 19th century, guns can be somewhat smaller, and everything being a little bit simpler can also be much more easily detached. There's a lot more open mounts and things. And at that point, those guns are not designed for land use, but they can be adapted for land use, again, by use of a mixture at that point of the ship's carpenters and the ship's engineers. So when, for example, Percy Scott brings his really big cruiser, one of the powerful class, to South Africa and hears about, hey, there's a siege being conducted by the Boers well inland, and the Boers have modern Krupp field artillery that's making a mockery of the Army's field artillery. He just takes the Naval Landing Brigade and goes, right, lads, unfortunately we're not taking the 9.2-inch guns, much as that would have been hilarious, but we're going to dismount some of our smaller guns. We're going to improvise some gun carriages, partly through just sheer mechanical fabrication, partly through borrowing various components off of the army, and then we're going to roll up with a bunch of really nice long-range heavy naval guns and instruct the Boers as to why you don't want to get into an artillery fight with the Royal Navy, because, well, at that point, hey, it's just like we've practiced, except we're not moving and the target's not moving. This is easy. ACC asks, the interwar naval treaties were a mixed bag. Naval development was constrained, but that had as much or more to do with national financial limitations and nations that cheated and eventually abandoned the treaties, but even the worst violators acted with more restraint than they otherwise would have. On balance, do you consider the treaties a net success or a net failure? What would it have taken for the treaties to be an unqualified success? To be an unqualified success, the treaties really need some kind of enforcement mechanism. Beyond the whole, no one wants to bankrupt themselves in a naval arms race, and if one of you does it, then everyone will do it, so let's not. But then the question comes about of how exactly are you going to do that? Are you going to build in some kind of mechanism that says, well, if this country is found to be in violation of the treaty, then everyone else who's a signatory of the treaty has to go up and sink the violating ships, committing themselves to a war? I don't think people, especially in the early 1920s, are going to sign up for that. And before anyone asks, no, incorporating it through the League of Nations is probably not the best idea, because while technically the League of Nations would give you that kind of theoretical authority, much like the UN gave the theoretical authority for the Korean intervention. Yeah, the idea of let's get the League of Nations involved, that's the one and only thing in international politics I can think of that is even less helpful than saying let's get the UN involved. And that's a pretty low bar to start with. Now, as for the actual treaties that were signed, I think of the three, Washington, London, and Second London, I would definitely say that Second London was a net failure, because Second London, albeit briefly, constrained the US and UK more than even First London did in a lot of ways. And at that point, Italy, Germany, and Japan were all, to varying degrees, building in violation of the treaty. So it essentially gave the Axis powers a little bit of a head start before the British and the Americans could go, actually, no, stuff this, we're also not going to abide by the treaty limits to varying degrees. So by inference, you could consider Washington and First London to be net successes. However, I think whether you judge them a net success or failure is when you consider what could have happened otherwise. And if you want to go for, say, two extreme examples, where you could consider them to be a net success would be alternative timeline 1, none of them get signed, and the naval arms race between Japan, the US, and the UK heats up. You know, the South Dakotas, Lexingtons, Tosas, Amagis, Keys, G3s, N3s, etc., are all built and flying down the slipways. Now, in terms of them being a success, i.e. they have averted something even more catastrophic, well, Japan's economy physically cannot sustain a naval arms race with either the US or the UK through the 1920s. At some point, they are going to economically crash out. Now, this is where I think the tipping point is, because as we saw with Japan in 1941, if they think they're going to economically crash out, in that case because of an oil blockade, their instinctive reaction is to turn around and hit somebody very, very hard, aka Pearl Harbor, in an attempt to, undo those circumstances. So, if Japan, seeing that its economy is going to collapse in the next couple of years through an unsustainable naval building race, decides, stuff this, we're going, double or nothing, and launches a massive naval war in the late 1920s, that, I think, would be fairly disastrous. And therefore, overall, you could say that if that would have happened, then the Washington and First London treaties avoiding that happening means that they could be considered a great success. Conversely, if that doesn't happen, i.e. Japan doesn't decide to just lash out, well, the fact is a naval building race would still make Japan economically crash out, but if it does so peacefully, relatively speaking, then that leaves the US and the UK with massive, fairly modern battle fleets, and that means that Italy and Germany, and to a lesser extent Japan as it eventually tries to recover, are going to be left with a much, much greater margin to catch up in, which in turn potentially helps to mitigate the effects of the Second World War, because if the US and the UK have massive fleets going into it, then obviously they have a much bigger naval advantage than even historically they did. And a slight variation on that, and obviously that shortens World War II, so in that case having the treaties would be considered a failure because they made things worse. And the sort of the finer balance in that would be perhaps that maybe you have the Washington Treaty, but then you just let it lapse. You don't have First or Second London. We've already said Second London's a bad idea. First London, though, if you don't have it, and Japan, the US and the UK start construction in the early 1930s, possibly as a means of a kind of a public's work program to try and kickstart some of their economy out of the Great Depression. Well, Japan still faces significant economic and logistical hurdles. But for the US and the UK, that gives them essentially the early 1930s, because they are going to have to play catch-up with Japan to a certain degree, because Japan will be building, so they don't really have that much of a choice. But they can spend the early 1930s, A, not sabotaging, in the case of the UK, their own shipbuilding and armament industry quite as much, but B, also building that armour, gun production, shipyards, etc., building those back up somewhat, as well as constructing cruisers, destroyers, capital ships earlier. Obviously not a full naval arms race rate, but a considerably higher rate than they did historically. Perhaps pulling in ship, and that therefore gives you the ability to pull ships in for a refit in the mid-1930s, because you have a bigger battle fleet going. And overall, that leaves the US and the UK with significantly larger, significantly more modern battle fleets going into the mid and late 1930s, which again leaves the Italians and the Germans in a much more difficult position in terms of playing catch-up, because the navies they're trying to play catch-up with are so much bigger and so much more of a threat. Robert Henry Ilston asks, on your The Sullivans walkthrough, I saw several arrows for directing foot traffic on walkways and stairs. Were those for tours, or was the ship's passageways narrow enough that traffic was one way? And if the latter, when would those restrictions be in place? The arrows in place nowadays are for directing foot traffic because, well, they're also not just one way, they're also directing you on a specific tour route. So they wouldn't be of much use in the Sullivans' active service life, because you'd end up wandering all over the ship trying to find your action station. But with that said, there are times that one-way traffic is implemented on a naval ship, including, of course, the Sullivans when she's in active service. So broadly speaking, even on something like a Fletcher-class destroyer, during peacetime or during general, not off-duty, but kind of non-active, non-action stations, non-general quarters, wartime cruising, you can mostly pretty much move around a ship in whichever direction you want, because the overall amount of foot traffic at any one time is going to be relatively small, and therefore it doesn't really matter which way you go down a particular passageway. Obviously, shift changes and or watch changes more specifically in a naval context, and meal times, there'll be more foot traffic, but they all tend to be going in the same direction anyway. But during action stations, in Royal Navy parlance, or general quarters, US Navy parlance, when you're called to your battle stations, then there is actually a set one-way system specifically to avoid collisions and delays and congestion when everyone's trying to get to and from the ship. And of course, exactly what layout that's going to be will vary not only on the ship in question, but also in terms of its class, destroyer, cruiser, layout, etc., but also even on the time period. Because obviously with the Sullivans, she's been refitted a few times, so the exact layout of one-way routes for her when she was freshly launched wouldn't necessarily work for her in her final configuration as she's preserved, because there'd be different weapon systems in different places. And finally, Captain Oblivious asks, it's a staple of many TV shows and movies centered on the golden age of sail that a ship sends a small party ashore into enemy territory to conduct recon or sabotage. How common was that, or is it just they're trying to spice up the plot and this was actually quite rare? Are there any real-life notable successes of such ventures? This is actually an example of what TV tropes would call truth in television. Landing small parties specifically for recon was actually very common in the Age of Sail, if you needed to conduct operations on or near land, obviously. Because from the sea, you could only get, the sea view. But if you suspected, thought, or even potentially knew that there were certain weaknesses of the enemy on a more landward side, then you could just sail off, put a landing party down, and they could do some sneaky recon for you. Remember, this is the era before any kind of long-distance communications, and everything is much more sparsely populated, so sailing off and landing a party, 5-10 miles down the coast out of sight essentially is about as stealthy an insertion as you can ever get. Depending on where you are, there might also be the potential of recruiting allies for your assault on what's presumably an enemy fortification, port or town. But of course, you do have to remember all of this is centered around if you need to complete some kind of objective on land, which is less common for most of the Age of Sail. But in the circumstances that you do need to, well, it can be quite a good idea. Sabotage, though, is less common of a mission, mostly because if there is an opportunity to land somewhere somewhat up or down the coast and send over a group of men to the point that they can get close enough to vital enemy assets to cause them physical harm, well, then at that stage, you might as well send in a full naval landing party, because if you can sabotage a fort or a town or a port or something, a slightly larger group might be able to actually take control of some or all of that, and or possibly provide a rather significant and ongoing distraction, which would allow your ship to, or ships to come in and accomplish that overall aim anyway. And that concludes this episode of The Drydock. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you again in another video soon. Bye for now.